Hello, my name's Kate Redshaw, and I'm delighted to be joined today again by one of our directors, James Green. And James, it's great to have you in the hot seat. And this time we're going to be talking about reluctant returners. And it was about a year ago that Luke and I were having a similar conversation. And of course, that return to the office back in August 2020 didn't really last very long. But I think after a very long haul, we are now in a position where employers can finally be asking their employees who have been working from home to come back to offices and workplaces. And I know that while some employers have been encouraging a return to work over the past few weeks, a lot of employers, I think, have been saying, well, let's keep with the status quo. Let's people sort of have their summer, and then there's a sense of back to school, back to work feel for September. And, you know, whilst there are certainly lots of people who are keen to get back to the office, my sense is there still are a fair number of people who are quite cautious, quite anxious, particularly about mixing with other people. So, James, today we're here to discuss what employers can do if over the next few months they find they've got staff who, despite the change in government guidance and Freedom Day, still don't want to return to work. But before we do so, I should just say that also relevant to the return to work will be testing and vaccinations. And just to say, we have got guidance notes on both of those topics for employers on our Burgess Salmon website. So do check those out. But before we look, James, at how employers might manage any reluctant returners, can we just do a quick scene set? Because for all that the legal restrictions around social distancing have now been removed, I mean, that doesn't give employers free rein to require people to get back into the office. There are still health and safety obligations, there are employment law obligations that need to be complied with before anybody can be required to return to the workplace. And also, we mustn't forget about the clinically extremely vulnerable. And, you know, are they having to return to the workplace as well?
Yes, great. Thanks, Kate. Pleasure to be in the hot seat for this one, of course. So just looking first at those health and safety obligations, perhaps. Employers, of course, have got a legal duty to take reasonable steps to ensure the safety of their workplace. And that includes providing a safe place for staff to work. And that in turn requires employers to carry out a risk assessment. And that, of course, isn't new. Employers have always had to do this, but of course, COVID brings particular risks to staff. So any risk assessment has to include measures to reduce the spread of COVID. Now, for employers who've been open and whose workplaces have been open throughout the pandemic, even if that's in a sort of skeleton capacity, they will have already been assessing risks, assessing the COVID risk, putting safety measures in place. So they'll be used to that sort of concept. But for those employers whose premises have been closed, they're going to need to update risk assessments to include COVID risks as part of their reopening plans. But I think it's important to remember that in any event, all employers who've had substantial numbers of staff working from home will need to revisit and revise their plans, because they'll need to take account of the increasing numbers or the increasing impact of those numbers coming back into the office, and they may want to do that in consultation with staff, with trade unions or employee reps as well, if that's appropriate.
Yeah, OK, understood. Yes, so employers are going to have to revisit and update their risk assessments as a priority. And James, it's probably also worth mentioning at the same time as the restrictions on social distancing were removed, the government also updated its suite of guidance for employers on working safely during coronavirus. I'm sure most of our viewers will be familiar with those. That's the guidance that applies to the various different work settings.
Yeah, absolutely right. And in terms of that guidance, employers will need to make sure that they're looking at the latest version as it applies to their own particular workplace to make sure they're taking into account the right guidance. Because this time the guidance hasn't just been tweaked, actually it's been completely overhauled. So, for example, offices, factories and labs, all now covered by the same guidance. But worth remembering that depending on the nature of your business, you might be subject to 2 or 3 different sets of guidance. So important to be alive to that issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as well as talking about risk assessments, that guidance references steps employers should take in terms of improving ventilation, cleaning, face coverings and so on. And although what I thought was really interesting actually is it doesn't talk about vaccines or the impact of having a fully or partially vaccinated workforce and what impact that might have on your risk assessment, other than to say, it does mention it in one place. I noticed it says that you still need to put measures in place to reduce the risk of transmission, even where people have been vaccinated. So even if your whole workforce has been vaccinated, you will need to still put in mitigating measures. But before we move on, James, can we just flip back to the clinically extremely vulnerable? They're no longer shielding, they haven't been shielding for some time now, but majority perhaps will have been working from home. Does the change in government guidance mean that those people now have to return to work?
Well, Kate, you're absolutely right. The clinically extremely vulnerable have not been asked to shield for some time now, and there's nothing in the guidance that prevents the clinically extremely vulnerable from returning to work. But having said that, the working safely guidance from the government advises employers to give particular higher consideration to the clinically extremely vulnerable. Employers are encouraged to talk to those employees on an individual basis to understand their particular needs, and indeed to action any particular things that might be required as a result of specific clinical recommendations. And whilst the Delta variant is so prevalent at the moment, that might include continuing to allow the clinically extremely vulnerable to work from home. I think not least because there is some evidence, I believe, that immunocompromised people may not respond quite so well as the vaccine to other members of the population.
Yeah, and it's probably also worth, I think, James, stressing here that every case is different, isn't it? So you're going to need to assess the individual, their role, your own workplace when making these decisions. But that's some really useful guidance there. Yeah,
indeed. And also actually probably worth mentioning at this point that if it isn't safe for an individual to return, including if they're clinically extremely vulnerable, then of course, and they can't work from home, then of course the furlough scheme is still available until the end of September. Although of course we're in a slightly different position now where employers have to contribute towards that cost.
Yes, no, good point. So let's assume, James, that the employer has everything set up as per the guidance. I've consulted with my employees, I've communicated effectively with them as to the steps that I've taken to keep people safe. When they come back into the office, how best do I respond to the person who says that they still don't want to come back and they would be happy, if I didn't mind, for them to keep working from home?
Yeah, that's the key question, I think. But just before we get on to that topic, let's pick up on this point about communication, because I really think it's worth emphasising that spending time on good communication with your employees about how you can look after them when they come back to the office is really going to pay off here. So many employers have made quite considerable changes to the workplace, to the layout, to ventilation and so on in the last 18 months. And things like videos to show changes to the workplace, or FAQs, and all these other sort of steps you can take, those are really valuable, I think, in showing staff that you take health and safety seriously, and that's really going to help minimise the number of people who feel uncomfortable about coming back.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I was just thinking there, I know more about ventilation systems now than I ever thought I would, James. Employers are doing all of this really good stuff, sanitized equipment, as I say, ventilation and so on, and they do need to use that to their advantage because, of course, so many people won't have been back to work at all during the last 18 months, and so a refresher video showing what's changed and what they can expect is going to be, I think, a really good idea. But back to the question in hand, what do we do with the people who still don't want to come back, and does their vaccination status make any difference?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to decide is what, as an employee, your ultimate position is going to be. So do you want a workforce that is broadly back in the office, subject, of course, to kind of hybrid working arrangements? Or are you going to be happy to let people who want to work from home to continue to do so? If not forever, then at least for the duration of the pandemic, however long that might be. But I think if you're happy for those people who want to stay working from home, then that's entirely fine. That's entirely a legitimate position to take. Just to be mindful that you'll need to be clear in your expectations about this and continue to kind of manage that group proactively. But I think for most employers, they're going to want people back in the office for at least some of the time. If that's your position, you're going to have to think about how far you're prepared to go if someone persistently refuses to come back. As always, important to consider each case on its own individual facts, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But I think ultimately the position is that if someone won't come back and there are no extenuating circumstances, then you're probably in a position where you're looking at disciplinary action and even eventually dismissal as options if it does come to that.
Yeah, I can see. I guess in some circumstances it could come to that. So, but what about the vaccination status of my reluctant returner? Does that make a difference in terms of the approach I can take?
In theory, no. Interestingly enough, I think the government has lifted the work from home restriction for everybody. So provided that your risk assessment says it's safe to return to the workplace, a person's vaccination status shouldn't change that in any way. So your starting point for employers who when you're faced with someone who doesn't want to come back to work, whether they're double vaxxed, single vaxxed, or not vaccinated at all, is really to understand what their concerns are. So we've all lived these strange, peculiar lives for the last 18 months. Many people won't have been back to their workplaces at all. And in fact, many people have been living very restrictive lives, even more recently, because they're concerned about the Delta variant or passing it on to vulnerable family members, whatever it might be. So I think the first thing to do in any circumstance is really to try and get to grips with an individual's particular concerns to see if we can understand those and address them.
Okay, I see. So that's back to explaining what steps I've taken, how their particular working environment will be operating and so on, with a view to, I guess, trying to allay those concerns. But what about making specific tweaks to somebody's working arrangements, if that would help, say, I don't know, allowing them to work in an office that's away from other people, or changing their hours of work to avoid public transport when it's busy? I mean, that public transport is continuing to cause a lot of concern. I think I've spoken to quite a few people who say actually it's not the office they've got a problem with, it's getting onto busy trains and tubes and so on.
No, absolutely. But I think as a principle, it's always going to be helpful to try and accommodate specific requests if it helps to bring someone back into the office. So trying to be flexible as far as possible has got to be a good idea, provided that doesn't give too much knock-on disruption. And it might be that actually just some changes on a temporary basis is all that's required. So sort of easing in period while someone gets used to the idea of travelling, gets used to the idea of public transport, gets confident in the way things work. That might well be that's all that's needed. I think the key thing to bear in mind with any temporary arrangement is you've got to be alive to the fact that if you make adjustments for one set of employees, you need to be able to consider whether those could be extended to others. So if you're setting a precedent, just make sure that it's something that you can happily roll out for others if that's necessary.
Yeah, you're right. Sort of having a run-in period is a really good idea. But I guess a caveat we ought to flag, James, relates to people with a disability, as you might need to treat those people slightly differently.
Yeah, that's right. If you have an employee who has a disability, then of course, depending on the nature of that disability, it may be they can't be vaccinated because they've got some underlying condition. You need to make reasonable adjustments to their role. And again, whilst we're in this period where there is this Delta variant out there, or indeed other variants in the future, that might include allowing them to work from home for the moment, or indeed by making adjustments to their working environment so they feel safe when they come back into the office. That might be by giving them a workplace that's separate or from other employees. Perhaps worth at this point thinking about pregnant employees as well. It's I know a topic that's received a lot of coverage. Just to remind people that many pregnant women have chosen not to have the vaccine, and we know that COVID represents a particular risk for women in their third trimester. So you may want to allow those employees to continue to work from home, or indeed think about some sort of medical suspension for that employee on full pay, of course, if the workplace can't be made safe for them.
Yeah, okay, that's very helpful guidance, James. So you've mentioned the Delta variant in the context of those with a disability or who are pregnant, but does it have an impact more widely? We know it's highly contagious and highly prevalent.
Yeah, I think that's going to depend on your sort of general strategy of how you get people back into the workplace. I think government guidance and indeed the approach most employers are taking is to have a sort of gradual return over the summer. And I think really that's the right approach, particularly given that the prevalence of those variants at the moment. So follow that guidance rather than trying to get everyone back into the workplace immediately at once.
Yeah, okay. And actually, James, that mention of following government guidance is really interesting. Sorry, the lawyer in me coming out now, because we've started to see a trickle of COVID-related employment tribunal decisions coming through. Obviously, these relate to sort of the pandemic in the earlier stages because they've had to trundle through the court system or the tribunal system. And there have been a number of claims dealing with employees who have resigned or been dismissed because they've refused to come into work because they're concerned about their own health and safety, or the health and safety of others, and those are known as Section 100 claims. And what those decisions are showing is that employers who have followed government guidance in terms of making their workplaces COVID secure seem to have been successfully defending claims, whereas those employers who have done very little in the way of taking the recommended steps have been losing. So adhering to that guidance and actually continuing to adhere to the guidance is going to be useful in the event that you do end up having to defend claims. But anyway, that was a little aside from me, a little lawyerly aside. Back to you, James, and your overarching strategy.
Yeah, I think the point is that if your strategy is going to be encourage a gradual return over the summer months, but you've got employees who are still nervous about returning, in fact, you may be happy to let them continue to work from home, assuming that you can't allay their concerns and it's feasible for them to carry on working from home. But I think, and coming back to this communication point again, I think it's important to caveat that concession with a reminder to them that by autumn or whenever it might be, subject to any government guidance again, you're going to be expecting them to return to the office on a full-time or part-time basis, whatever it is. If you're implementing a hybrid working model, then following that guidance. But just to be really clear about the expectation that actually there will be a preference to get them back into the workplace by within that time frame.
Yeah, I see. And I suppose the bottom line is that providing your risk assessment is up to scratch, employers do have the scope to require employees to return to the office. I mean, assuming a contract of employment is in place which states, the place of work as being the office, then employees are bound by that contract and are contractually obliged, to attend, aren't they, to carry out their role. But what about people who won't be jabbed? So it's not just that they're waiting to be jabbed, they're actually saying that they're not going to have the jab. Could they argue that their refusal to have a vaccine is a philosophical belief and it's protected, and therefore that as a non-vaccinated person, they're more at risk? And so any requirement for them to return to the office is whether it's now or later, is potentially discriminatory.
So we've got this position where government guidance says anyone, regardless of vaccination status, can come back to the workplace. So a requirement to return in itself isn't going to be discriminatory, assuming that your risk assessment shows you can bring them back to work in a safe way. As to whether anyone who or anyone can show that a refusal to have the vaccine constitutes a philosophical belief, I think that's a trickier one to land on at the moment. We've got this recent Employment Appeal Tribunal decision in Forstnatter, which arguably widens what could be termed a philosophical belief. That being said, I'm possibly sceptical that simply being an anti-vaxxer or being reluctant to be vaccinated in itself is going to be enough to amount to a philosophical belief. I mean, yeah, we can't say for sure at this point. It's probably a matter that's going to be tested by the tribunals before too long, I would think.
Yeah, I would imagine so. And then what about people who are rejecting the vaccine for religious reasons?
Yeah, I mean, I'd hesitate to profess a full understanding of the approach of all religious groups here, but my understanding is that the major world religions generally have no explicit objections to vaccination, but there are some groups certainly where there's a precedent of rejecting vaccination in general. So we may well see that point being raised. And again, it's an area where we may see claims arising in time. I think it's just one to watch.
Yeah, well, as ever, James, with all things COVID, cliche alert, interesting times. So James, before we close, let's just look at what an employer can do if, despite their best efforts, they've done videos, they've had chats, etc., the employee simply refuses to return. They're too anxious, they want to continue working from home. Does the employer have to allow this? And if not, what can they practically do?
Okay, so I think as we've touched on, it's going to be really important to understand the particular individual circumstances in every case. But I think in general terms, what we'd say is, whilst COVID is still prevalent, employers may be happy to let employees to work from home. And for the cautious employer who really wants no risk of claims, that's probably the safest thing to do. But if you want your people back in, and assuming again that guidance remains consistent with that, and your risk assessment shows that your working environment is safe, then ultimately, if you've got an employee who fails to come back to work when requested to do so, they're likely to be in breach of their employment contract. And what that means, of course, is that as an employer, you'll be able to take disciplinary action and eventually, subject to fair process and all the usual requirements, eventually you'll be able to dismiss. But assuming there's no extenuating circumstances, the employee whose contract specifies the office as their place to work, they've got no right to continue to work from home if it actually is safe for them to come back into work. So an employer, I think, in the right circumstances can be quite robust here.
Okay, that's interesting. And because I've heard some people arguing that they should be allowed to continue to work from home indefinitely, really because they've been working in that way for the last 18 months. So, that's a legitimate position, if you like. But I mean, I don't see that an employer needs to agree to that, not least because an environment where everybody is working remotely is one thing, but if everybody is back in the office on a full-time or part-time basis, that's a very different way of working, isn't it? I mean, so to say it's no different, to carry on as you are, it's going to be no different to what's been happening over the last 18 months. I don't know, to my mind, doesn't really hold up.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Kate. There are all sorts of valid reasons as to why you want people back. It might be supervision obligations, it might be for training, might be a line management responsibility issue, I think, or indeed just kind of workplace culture generally. Really important part of the modern workplace. And do you lose that if you've got everyone working remotely? Not beyond the realms of possibility that, of course, that someone in that position might put in a flexible working request to change their place of work to home. You need to deal with that properly, of course, because it's a statutory right. But you don't necessarily need to agree to every request, because there are going to be these sorts of business reasons available to employers to justify turning down those flexible working requests.
James, I don't know if you know that you've done this, but you give me a nice segue to allow me to plug a previous conversation I've had with Luke Barry about flexible working, which, if people are interested, you can find on the Burgess Salmon YouTube channel. So thank you for that, James. As ever, we've talked for a long time, probably longer than we wanted to, but there are just so many points at issue here. So I think it might be helpful to summarise. Essentially, employers need to familiarise themselves with that updated working safely guidance and get their risk assessments up to date. Consult and communicate with employees about how what you've been doing in terms of keeping employees safe as they return, and then take the time to speak to employees who are reluctant about coming back to try and understand what the concerns are and to try and look to alleviate those concerns. And I do think I'm going to be positive on this one. I do think if handled sensitively, that approach actually should resolve most issues. But if it doesn't, then ultimately there may be scope to take disciplinary action. The caveat, I guess, to that being to watch out for anybody who might have protection under the discrimination laws. So James, I think it's time now to draw things to a close. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you so much to everyone for watching. An interesting discussion. I think it's going to be an interesting few months. We do have guidance notes, and I've mentioned some of the other conversations we have on our website, Burgess Salmon website, so do have a look at the resources there. If you've got any queries about COVID, please do get in touch. We've been helping lots of employers with their issues over the last 18 months, or indeed if you've got any other employment issues, we would also be delighted to help. So please just get in touch. Thanks very much for watching. Goodbye.